I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Eliza. Is that correct? Or
Eliza, yep.
Eliza Barach, or I should have asked you ahead of time how to pronounce your name.
That's okay. That's a trick. It's a tricky one. It's Barach.
Okay. Dr. Eliza Barach, who I read was diagnosed herself with ADHD at age 17, and it sounds like has sort of taken the world by storm since then. She got her BA, MA, and PhD in cognitive psychology and found that academia was a little too in the box for her out of the box thinking, and has moved to coaching, though she's done a lot of research as well. And I forgot what I was going to say. She was brought to us by the Social Action Committee in trying to diversify our topics and our speakers. And this is really about neurodiversity and her refreshing approach to it, not as a deficit to be medicated and gotten rid of, but to be harnessed and to really work with. So with that, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that awesome introduction and just for this wonderful opportunity. I'm really excited to talk about ADHD with everyone today. So I'm just going to share my screen so you guys can see the PowerPoint, and we'll run right through. And can everyone see that okay? Does it look okay?
Yep. Looks
Perfect.
good.
Perfect. So the title of my talk is a deep dive into ADHD, acknowledging challenges while bolstering neurodivergent strengths. So just a couple of goals that I have for this talk. First is just to illuminate the paradoxical nature of ADHD. It's a very interesting, mental difference or mental disorder with a very much so paradoxical nature. It sometimes has a little bit of conflicting experiences. So I want to dive into, talking a little bit about that, and particularly how that's likely driven by, an interest-based nervous system. And I'll dive into more about what I mean by that as we go through the talk. And then, as we talk about this different way of working in terms of the nervous system, we're also going to talk about some of these ADHD strengths that these individuals likely possess, and some of the mechanisms behind them that help to explain why individuals with ADHD might be more likely to possess some of these strengths, and kind of, again, look at some of the cognitive mechanisms and some of the neurochemistry that might help to explain why this might be common in these individuals. So first and foremost, I think it's always helpful to start with definitions and really think about, what is ADHD? I think we all have different ideas of what that looks like. And I'm sure in your clinical practices, you've all seen, different presentations. A lot of times, though, we think of ADHD as that little hyperactive boy that's running around the classroom, and it very much can be that. But it's also the space cadet. It's that little girl looking out the window, daydreaming, thinking of all these different things that are interesting to her and potentially not paying attention in the classroom. And then we see a lot of the times a little bit of disorganization, chaotic desks, can't find things. And it's true that these are different aspects of what ADHD looks like. And if we look at the DSM-5 definition, and I won't dive too deeply into this because I'm not a clinician, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with the DSM-5 definition already, but the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD, there's a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. We have 3 different presentations. We have inattentive, which is, again, has symptoms of difficulties with focusing, maybe losing things, hyperactive impulsive, so trouble, sitting still when you're supposed to, making quick decisions without thinking through them. And then we also have combined, where individuals will meet criteria for both inattentive and hyperactive impulsive. So this is the diagnostic criteria that we're working with. And as you can see, it is pathology driven. which is understandable given that it's in the DSM-5 and this is our medical model. And of course, diagnoses are important for insurance amongst a number of different things. If we also look at prevalence, about 8.8% of children in the United States have ADHD, and about 4.4 adults in the United States have ADHD. Pretty common neurodevelopmental disorder in our children, and it's starting to become more prevalent in adulthood. And we do know that, diagnosis as a child, it usually stays with you. Kids don't grow out of ADHD. It tends to follow you throughout your adulthood, throughout your life. But so far, I've really focused on kind of some of the challenges with ADHD, and rightfully so. I do not want to diminish the challenges that do come with having this disorder, because they are very real. But at the same time, a lot of there's a good portion of individuals who have ADHD who have done extraordinary things. Our ADHDers are innovative, they're driven, they're passionate. We have some incredible athletes like Simone Biles. We've got Michael Phelps. We've got comedians. We've got actors and actresses like Victoria Pedretti. She's on Netflix and a couple of different shows. She credits a lot of her success to her ADHD. We've also got singers and rappers like will.i.am, who was a part of the Black Eyed Peas, also credits much of his success and his creative ability to having ADHD. And we've got entrepreneurs and inventors. Thomas Edison was believed to have ADHD and also credited some of his, inventions to the different way that his brain worked. We also have Richard Branson, who again credits a lot of his successes as an entrepreneur to his ADHD. And Richard Branson, if you guys don't know, but I feel like you would know, he's the founder of Virgin Mobile. So on the one hand, we have, these individuals who really are struggling. It's hard to focus, hard to pay attention, losing things, maybe making quick decisions without thinking them through. But then on the flip side, we have some individuals who have really, really excelled and have credited their successes to their ADHD. And this is what brings me to looking at ADHD as a disorder of paradoxes. So as I mentioned, on the one hand, we've got individuals just can't focus, it's just they can't attend to the classroom, or sometimes they can't attend to their partners. But then on the flip side, if they get involved in something that's really, really interesting to them, that they're really passionate about, they get this laser hyper focus, where you can't tear them away, and they're able to, bang out a lot of work in a short amount of time. And a lot of individuals, when they get into that laser hyper focus, they do have a positive view on that. It is a positive experience, and then we also see 0 to 100, bouncing off the walls, an abundance of energy, go, driven by a motor. And then on the other hand, it's like you can't get yourself going. You got to just, lay on the couch. There's nothing that's driving you. And so you get this 0 to 100, and very, very paradoxical. And then finally, this is actually one of my favorite examples, is we've got the sensation-seeking behavior, out to see the world, want to experience lots of new things, and they're very much driven to do so. But then on the other hand, there comes this overstimulation. So, engaging in this sensation-seeking behavior and then flooding yourself, and then kind of having to retreat away and kind of hide from the world. So again, very, very paradoxical. So with these extremes and cycling through them, the biggest challenge that I think these individuals face is regulation. And so this paradoxical nature can in part be explained by challenges in regulating one's attention, one's motivation, and things along those lines. And so it's been argued that a more fitting description of ADHD is a disorder of attention regulation than a deficit of attention. So being able to kind of regulate and harness your attention, your motivation, that's really the challenge. And that's what brings me to arguing that, ADHD is an interest-based nervous system. This isn't just my idea. This is a common argument in the field right now. And so regulation for individuals with ADHD, it's dictated by a different set of rules. For people without ADHD, they can be driven by importance. And what that means is they are more sensitive to true consequences, or the consequences that can be imposed on individuals. That clicks with individuals without ADHD. Their nervous system picks up on that. For people without ADHD, it doesn't work that same way. This nervous system is driven by interest and stimulation. So if there's appropriate levels of stimulation, maybe if it's urgency for as one example, if there's a level of challenge, so that right kind of difficult, if it's new and exciting, it's novel. And then, as I mentioned, if they're interested, if they have passion in this, that's where we see their ability to actually access some of these beautiful strengths that they do have. So for someone with ADHD, if a task is not intrinsically rewarding or sufficiently stimulating, they're going to have greater difficulty focusing on that task at hand. But as I mentioned, this interest-based nervous system, in the presence of strong incentives, we will see normalized executive function performance in individuals with ADHD. So if there is a level of buy-in, whether again it's interest or maybe there's challenge, we will see these individuals we will see that these individuals are better able to access their executive functions and access some of these incredible strengths that they do have. So under very specific conditions, individuals with ADHD can exhibit extraordinary strengths. Not only is it the case that executive function might be normalized, but it also might give them a better opportunity to access some of these strengths of hyperfocus, creativity, energy, and drive. So if we can match up an individual with ADHD with an environment that supports how their nervous system works, we're going to put them in a better position to be able to access the awesome strengths that they do possess. So this brings me to that question of, why are we not hearing more about ADHD strengths? And well, most of the research really does zero in on the deficits and challenges, and understandably so. If a problem is presented, we want to try to solve that problem. But if we're only focusing on what's going wrong, we're missing out on the opportunity of what also is going right, because label or no label, any individual has a lot of things that are going well for them and probably some things that are not going well for them. So if we want to approach individuals with ADHD, more holistically in a balanced approach, it would be really helpful to understand what goes right for them. And so that's kind of, a nice segue into what does go right for them and why should we actually focus on that. So some of the strengths that have been reported in the literature, and I do want to say that this is an emerging literature, much more work needs to be done. A lot has been more self-report based, with some studies moving more into the empirical, more experimental manipulation space. But what we see in the literature is that some of the strengths that have been self-reported or observed are this in an intense energy and drive. So individuals with ADHD can have an abundance of energy. They can be very, very driven. There's a more emerging literature on creativity. This is one of the stronger areas of research. So it's likely the case that individuals with ADHD might be more creative than neurotypicals. That is also still up for debate, and I'll talk more about that as we move forward. There's also been evidence to suggest that individuals with ADHD are more likely to engage in hyperfocus, which is kind of similar to flow, and it's also up for debate, but essentially just having that laser focus and being able to really crank some work out efficiently and quickly. There's also some evidence that individuals with ADHD tend to be more agreeable. They also show that they tend to be more empathic and engage in more altruistic behavior. So a lot of people with ADHD are very willing to help others. There's also support that individuals with ADHD exhibit bravery and risk-taking, which is essentially flipping hyperactivity and impulsivity on its head, seeing the positive sides of that particular symptom. And then we also see that a lot of individuals with ADHD are more likely to engage in entrepreneurial pursuits. And again, that might also be a product of energy and drive and creativity, as well as a willingness to take a risk. So why focus on strengths? Well, taking a strengths-based approach can have a very positive impact on an individual's well-being. And so this is pulling from some of the positive psychology research. So focusing on strengths could, in a sense, be a protective factor. And this is true for anyone. But why am I making such a big deal out of this for individuals with ADHD? Well, let's actually take a look at the ADHD experience. So children who have ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages from the adults in their lives than their friends and siblings who do not have ADHD. This is an estimate that comes from William Dotson, who's a psychiatrist that specializes in ADHD. There is a lot of negative messages that are being sent to these individuals. And then when we look at adults with ADHD, they report experiencing high levels of explicit and perceived criticism. And that can contribute to less self-passion as well as stigma and negativity toward themselves. And if you've worked with anyone with ADHD, you know that they are the biggest critic on themselves. They are so hard on themselves. And a part of this is potentially because of the negative messages that they've often received, and then explicit and then perceived criticism. This experience of negative messages, throughout one's life, it's not surprising that individuals with ADHD often have comorbid conditions, because, comorbidity is the rule with ADHD, not the exception. Adults with ADHD, 47% experience a comorbid anxiety disorder and 38% experience a comorbid mood disorder. And the reason that I bring this up is because with the challenges with emotional dysregulation that individuals with ADHD have, when they experience criticism, whatever that critique is in that moment, it's not just that critique, it's every critique that they've experienced like that before. And so we're talking about the floodgates are coming in. And again, this is a challenge with regulation. So the ability to inhibit the intensity of those emotions is going to be much more difficult. And this comes from some of the research on what we call the spreading of activation theories. So the idea is that you get information that stimulates similar information in your brain. And so you get essentially the spreading of activation, meaning that other like concepts or like memories are also going to be stimulated. So if you're someone with ADHD, you've got weak floodgates. What happens is, well, that gets activated and the floodgates open up. And this leaves you open to experiencing very, very intense negative emotions. So this is setting the stage. So why identify new strengths? Well, a random control, an RCT experiment showed that by identifying and using one's strengths, it can lead to increases in happiness and decreases in depression for 6 months. So using and identifying strengths can contribute to a greater experience of positive emotions, and therefore has potential for an increase in positive outcomes, as well as contributing to a better overall psychological well-being. And specifically, this pulls from the broaden and build theory of emotions, which is also from the positive psychology literature. So experiencing positive emotions, likely from experiencing successes from using your strengths, and also just being able to identify the things that you're good at, that builds self-esteem and confidence. And in doing so, this experience of positive emotions allows you to have a broader range of possible thoughts that you might have, possible actions that you could implement or use, as well as increasing your ability to build long-lasting personal resources along the physical, intellectual, social, and psychological realms. So there's a lot of benefits in using and identifying strengths in terms of increasing overall well-being. But I want to also reiterate a word of caution. It is very important to identify the positives that come with neurodivergence and ADHD, but it's also really important that we are careful to not diminish the very real challenges that individuals with ADHD face, as well as individuals that are part of the neurodivergent community. This is not to say that we should only focus on the strengths and kind of put the challenges in a box over here. We need to have a balanced approach that acknowledges both the challenges and the strengths. And so this leads me into the 3 strengths that I will talk about. I'll first kind of define them, talk about the research that supports them, and then some of the mechanisms that might explain why individuals with ADHD are likely to possess some of these strengths. So first and foremost, creativity. Like I said, I like to start with definitions, and I think they're important. So what exactly is creativity? We can think of creativity as the generation of new and useful ideas or novel connections. So an ability to come up with, different possibilities, and also connect ideas that you may not on face value think could be related. We can break creativity down into 2 types of thinking. First is divergent thinking, and this is an ability to generate multiple novel ideas or solutions to a given problem. On the other side, we've got convergent thinking, and I always like to think of convergent thinking as like the funneling part of creativity. So this tends to be a linear process of finding the answer that is the best fit to a question, to a task or a problem at hand. So it tends to be that funneling approach. If we look at the creative process, at first we have a task or a problem. And at the beginning of this process, we tend to more heavily rely on divergent thinking. So again, coming up with those ideas and lots of different ideas. So this is like the brainstorming stage. As we start to have to come to a decision, or we need to find the best solution, that's when we start to rely more heavily on convergent thinking. And then, we get to our solution. So if you had to take a stab at this, which part of creativity or which type of thinking do you think individuals with ADHD tend to excel at?
I'm not sure if people are unmuted to
Oh, okay.
um,
I see in the chat,
there you go.
divergent thinking. Yes, absolutely. 100%. Individuals with ADHD are excellent at divergent thinking. They tend to excel at it, and not surprisingly, they tend to have a little bit less success with convergent thinking. That tends to be the harder part with that filtering process. So it's also not surprising that individuals with ADHD also have a greater preference for ideation and brainstorming. So again, that divergent thinking, they tend to really enjoy that, and they tend to be really good at it. And I think part of the reason why they tend to be good at that is because they are less influenced by contextual constraints during a creative activity. So what I mean by that is, if individuals with ADHD are given an example, and they have to generate new ideas for that example. So let's say it's toys or animals. So if you give them an example of a toy, individuals with ADHD are less likely to produce ideas that conform to that toy, to that example, whereas people without ADHD, they're more likely to produce similar examples to that toy or that animal. So there seems to be a little bit of a protective factor for people with ADHD who are going to be less, influenced by pressure or ideas from other people, and they're more likely to have, those out of the box ideas. Lastly, individuals with ADHD, they're more likely to have greater reports of real world achievements. So they're more likely to have, creative achievements, like maybe producing music, maybe it's art, maybe going, into their own business, creating a product, or, creating an invention. So looking a little bit at why people with ADHD might excel. Well, if we first look at some of the, the neurochemistry, particularly individuals with ADHD have lower baseline levels of norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that is very much involved in regulating alertness. It's involved in fight or flight as well. So high levels of norepinephrine are going to be associated to kind of with fight or flight, kind of narrowing of attention, narrowing of focus. However, lower levels of norepinephrine have been linked to greater creativity. Part of this, again, is because these lower levels actually promote diffuse attention. So we broaden our scope of attention, which allows us to take in a greater amount of information, consider more possibilities, and it also allows for more inward thinking. Because, if we have low levels of norepinephrine, likely not in a threat state, so we're probably, not really going to be concerned with how to survive because there's not a need for it. So we're not going to be in that more narrow scope of attention that's really going to only attend to the things that are going to help us to survive. We're probably less concerned with what's the best idea, and more concerned about, okay, what is going to get me out of this really uncomfortable situation? How do I dodge out of the way of this, saber-toothed tiger? So obviously high levels, not very conducive to creative thought. But as I mentioned, individuals with ADHD, they tend to have lower baseline levels of norepinephrine, which might position them to be better adept at engaging in creative thought. Along those same lines, we're going to see lower inhibitory control as well as greater distractibility. So these are, symptoms that individuals with ADHD experience, but they're also, symptoms that are very good for creative thought. So when we have lower inhibitory control and greater distractibility, essentially what's happening is that our attention, as I mentioned, is going to be more diffuse. That means we're going to be picking up lots of different things in our environment, and our working memory is not going to be inhibiting these concepts and ideas. So this filtering challenge externally and internally that we typically see is actually beneficial here, because it's allowing an individual to identify a lot of different things that they may not have been able to identify otherwise. So this is their kind of natural baseline. They're able to pick up a lot of different things and bring them in. And then because of this, it's going to promote opportunities for more random thoughts and ideas, as well as processing of what might be seemingly irrelevant information. So taking in all of this information, looking at things that maybe don't seem like they would be relevant, and not having our working memory suppress them, allows an individual to have a greater chance of making connections amongst different ideas that one may not have originally seen. And therefore, this increases chances of insight. So that aha moment that, I know exactly how I'm going to solve this. And so that, again, requires this diffuse thought. In this realm of, lower inhibitory control and greater distractibility, if we look at the default mode network in the brain, for individuals with ADHD, this network tends to be particularly active, and this network is involved in daydreaming, mind wandering, as well as internally focused thought. So it's also essentially very much involved in creative thought too, particularly in the divergent thinking space, because again, it's this diffuse attention, kind of a wandering or like a bopping around to different ideas. So on the flip side, we have an opposing network called the task positive network. So this network is, I kind of think of it more as the analytical, very goal oriented, more external focused, outcome driven network in the brain. And so for people with ADHD, being able to switch over into that network is challenging. And that network is likely more involved with the convergent thinking part. So filtering out to that best solution. So you can kind of see how individuals with ADHD are potentially better positioned for divergent thinking, given that their default mode network tends to stay particularly active, and they have a harder time kind of switching over into the task positive network. And this is supposed to be an inverse relationship, meaning that when we switch over to the task positive network to engage in goal oriented behavior, taking steps to filter down to that best solution, for people with ADHD, instead of the default mode network quieting down when this happens, it actually kind of lurks around in the background, which is what's promoting a little bit of that distractibility. So that shift tends to be very, very challenging for individuals with ADHD. Last point here is, again, so these slight distractions, so the default mode network tending to be extra active, can result in noticing these seemingly, irrelevant things, which could produce greater novelty and originality in their, in the ideas and solutions that they come up with. So there is a little bit of a trade-off. It might be the case that, it takes individuals a little bit longer to identify solutions, but this distractibility is beneficial because it might put them in a better position to identify more novel and original ideas or solutions. Next is hyperfocus, and I have to say this is actually one of my favorite strengths. This is the one that I think got me through my PhD, and has really, really been an asset in my life, although it does come with a set of challenges too. But let's again start with a definition here. So what exactly is hyperfocus? So there's been a lot of anecdotal reports around hyperfocus, and there is a push to study it more systematically and empirically in the lab. But in terms of the anecdotal definition that we could work with, hyperfocus can be described as heightened focused attention that's frequently reported by individuals with ADHD. They often, describe it as being, intensely focused, losing sense of the passage of time, and it really just feeling like them in the task itself. It sort of has, it sounds very similar to flow, and it's been argued in the literature that maybe hyperfocus and flow are the same thing, but again, still up for debate. Hyperfocus is very, very frequently referenced in the popular media. If you do a Google search of hyperfocus, you will find an abundance of articles talking about ADHD and hyperfocus and how it's a strength and a challenge, and how does it work, which again is still under development. But as I mentioned, there's been a lot of anecdotal reports, but more of a push to study it empirically. And so there's been a recent development in, a working definition or an operational definition. And so Hupfield's work, aimed to do this so that we could have more systematic research to start to really tease apart this phenomenon. So Hupfield states that, hyperfocus is a state of heightened, intense focus of any duration, which most likely occurs during activities related to one's school, hobbies, or screen time, so television, computer, phone, etc. This state may include the following qualities: timelessness, failure to attend to the world, ignoring personal needs, difficulty stopping and switching tasks, feelings of total engrossment in the task, and feeling stuck on the small details. So looking at the research that has found support for hyperfocus in individuals with ADHD. So, simply put, adults with ADHD can, hyperfocus on activities of special interest. I really, really want to hit home on that part of special interest, as we talked about very early on. Interest or incentives can normalize executive functions in individuals with ADHD. And so, individuals with ADHD are more likely to hyperfocus, more frequently than neurotypical controls in general and across a range of settings. So like school, hobbies. There's also been evidence to show evidence of a positive relationship between ADHD diagnosis and symptomology and hyperfocus. And then in one particular study, they used EEG and had individuals with and without ADHD play video games. And what the EEG record showed is that when playing video games, individuals with ADHD actually required less cognitive effort relative to neurotypical controls, which is consistent with experiences of hyperfocus. It's possible that given that there was less cognitive effort needed, there might be enhanced intentional engagement or enhanced intentional control. So looking at the mechanisms driving hyperfocus, what I will state here too is, again, this is an emerging literature and we don't have a lot to work with. So some of this, again, is cited from the research and some of this is speculation based on the research we have out there. So given the fact that individuals with ADHD might be more likely to experience this zoomed in, very, very keyed in focus, it's been argued that, ADHD exhibits a different attentional style. As I mentioned at the beginning, ADHD is not a deficit of attention. It's really a challenge in regulation. There's an abundance of attention, and it's a matter of how can we regulate it and what conditions promote optimal regulation. And so thinking about attention as a filter, and this is pulling from the filter theories of attention in the cognitive psychology realm, we can think of attention as a filter, and filters have holes. So someone without ADHD oftentimes is going to have a more fine-grained, mesh filter, and they are going to have better regulation of the size of those holes. So they might be in a better position to be able to engage more in diffuse thinking when they need to, and then more narrow local thinking when they need to. With ADHD, I always joke that it's like having a colander for a filter. So we've got these big holes and we don't really know when the holes are going to get smaller or larger. We don't always have as much the ability to regulate the size of those holes relative to someone without ADHD. So what that means is, lots of information is coming in and not much is getting kicked out. But under sufficient stimulation, interest, if there's appropriate intrinsic motivation, this normalizes this executive function performance. So this means that individuals with ADHD are going to have better control of their attentional scope. So if we can provide conditions that are a match for their interest, for that, whatever that appropriate level of stimulation is, that puts them in a better position to be able to regulate the size of their filter, use more keyed in narrow focus, and likely engage in, some of these expensive attention tasks at a very high degree of acuity. And it's possible to, under conditions of sufficient stimulation, interest, motivation, we're going to see maybe more appropriate, with this appropriate level of stimulation, we can see potentially an increase in phasic dopamine. So basically increasing dopamine within the cell, and that maybe provides a better opportunity for more available dopamine in the prefrontal cortex to actually bind to the receptors, and actually get that chemical message across to, hey, let's key in, let's focus in. This experience of hyperfocus tends to be viewed very positively. And so with the experience of positive emotions, that's a good thing. And it likely allows individuals to engage in tasks for a much longer time than is typical for them. And as I mentioned with that study looking at individuals with and without ADHD playing video games and using EEG to measure their brain waves, when they were, hyper-focusing in that task, playing the video games, the ADHD brains actually showed greater parietal activation relative to neurotypicals, which actually suggested enhanced attentional processing, because typically what we see in people with ADHD is lower parietal activation, which reflects impaired attentional processes. So under, again, sufficient conditions, under environments that are a good fit for individuals with ADHD, particularly with interest, challenge, novelty, urgency, passion, we're going to see this opportunity for enhanced, attentional processing. Again, this literature is still developing. And there is mixed empirical evidence. So I always say, take this with a grain of salt, as more research is needed to really flesh out what is going on for these individuals. In terms of this mixed empirical evidence, I think one of the challenges that we face, particularly in this literature, is making lab conditions for individuals with ADHD interesting enough or stimulating enough to actually elicit hyperfocus. Because again, the key thing here is it's something they're able to do it with things that they're interested in, that they often feel positively about, or again, it's appropriate levels of stimulation. It's challenging enough. Maybe there's a level of urgency, but it's meeting them at the appropriate threshold for arousal for them. I will say we might have a better shot with college kids if we, offer them more money. That often is a good incentive, because, we don't usually have a lot of money in college, and sometimes that can kick up enough incentive to be able to elicit hyperfocus. But again, more work is needed here. Lastly is entrepreneurship. And what I will say is the two strengths I talked about already, creativity and hyperfocus, I think definitely contribute to this strength or this area of opportunity for people with ADHD. What we see in the literature is that individuals with ADHD are more likely to engage in entrepreneurial pursuits. They're more likely to have intentions to start their own business, and they're more likely to actually pursue self-employment. And again, they tend to have an orientation or a mindset that tends to be a very good fit or is in line with the entrepreneurial pursuit or entrepreneurial spirit. So why though? Why are individuals with ADHD more likely to engage in entrepreneurial pursuits? Well, if we look at symptoms, individuals with ADHD, they tend to be sensation seekers. They tend to have a little bit of a flavor of impulsivity. And if you combine sensation seeking and impulsivity with their high energy and their high drive, this puts them in a better position to be willing to take risks for something that they believe in. So if they believe very strongly in something, if they have passion for something, they're going to be more likely to take that leap. And in those situations too, these are new situations, they're viewing them very positively, and they do not premeditate when faced with uncertain opportunity. And this is actually one of my favorite findings in the literature, because, when I did my PhD, it was a completely impulsive choice. My older brother said to me, Eliza, you're like really good at psychology. You should do a PhD. And I said, okay, sure, I'll do it. I didn't want to go into the workforce yet because I didn't know what I wanted to do, but my brother was like, you're really good at this. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it. Didn't really do that much research into it. I was like, this sounds like a good idea. And I just jumped right in. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. It was very challenging, though. I think if I had known the challenges, maybe I wouldn't have done it. Jokes aside, but again, this tendency to not do this premeditation is really helpful because it puts someone in a better position to take high risks that have the potential for high payout and also high loss, and that's critical to the entrepreneurial performance. So really, again, focusing on the positives and not thinking about the negatives is one of these strengths that individuals possess that allows them to have a better chance in the entrepreneurial world. Similarly, entrepreneurial performance depends on one's openness and curiosity. And with individuals with ADHD tending to be more likely to engage in sensation seeking and also take risks, this tends to fit very well within this realm. So they tend to be more open and tend to be more curious, and this fits in this space. Again, as I mentioned, individuals with ADHD are more likely to be creative, particularly in the divergent thinking space. And so that ability to think of lots of different ideas, make connections amongst ideas that maybe other people might not see, puts them in a great position to be able to identify gaps and needs within different markets or different spheres of the world of the economy. And then lastly, this energy and this drive and having passion for an idea, not only does it, in conjunction with sensation seeking, allow them to take risks for something that they believe in, but it also might provide greater opportunities to engage in hyper focus. So again, if it's something of interest, they're more likely to, get this laser intense focus and then have very positive outcomes that come from it. Again, research has shown that individuals, when they engage in hyperfocus, have been able to produce some really important, products that they're proud of, whether it's composing music or maybe it's writing a book or a paper. It does provide this opportunity for that laser hyperfocus. So in summary, ADHD is paradoxical in nature, and this is a result of an interest-based nervous system. So when you play by the rules of the ADHD nervous system, you're going to see these strengths. You're going to see hyperfocus. You're going to see, an ability to get things done, to have high energy. But when you're in conditions that are not a good fit for that nervous system, that's a lot of times where we see some of the deficits, the challenges. So again, I want to, hit home at this point of under supportive conditions, ADHDers possess extraordinary strengths, and identifying the environments and conditions that promote accessibility to those strengths and also essentially are going to give them a chance to have normalized executive function is crucial. So individuals with ADHD, as I mentioned, they exhibit greater divergent thinking and have a greater reports of creative accomplishments. This is likely a result of reduced inhibitory control, lower levels of norepinephrine, and also where we see benefits of greater distractibility. The other thing I wanted to mention too with the creative accomplishments is I think this is where we see also risk-taking coming into play, because I think individuals with ADHD, whether it's truly the case they're more creative than people without ADHD, whether that's the case or not, they definitely have a greater willingness to put themselves out there. And so that might put them in a better position to have more real-world creative accomplishments because they have a willingness to try and put themselves out there. In the realm of hyperfocus, it's suggesting, although very preliminary research, that individuals with ADHD are more likely to experience hyperfocus. Some of this might be because of differences in parietal activation, and as well as showing that incentives can normalize executive functions. Individuals with ADHD are more likely to be entrepreneurs. This is potentially a result of greater sensation seeking, risk taking, having the hyperactive and impulsivity symptoms work well for them, and then also greater creativity. So my take home message is, individuals with ADHD absolutely have challenges that they face. Again, I do not want this to be diminished because that is also a disservice, but they also have incredible strengths that are of value. And so there really needs to be a push to have a more balanced view of ADHD, having a more broad perspective on it and extending, diagnostic criteria into areas of both ability versus disability and environmental factors versus barriers. So when are we seeing environmental facilitators that are going to essentially facilitate these strengths and their awesome abilities? And then when are we seeing barriers that result in, these different characteristics being viewed more as a disability or obviously not serving them? And that is the end of my talk. And I just want to thank you all for your time and attention. I feel like you have to thank people for their attention when you give a talk on ADHD. I also just want to give a special thank you to Dr. Peggy Liu for reaching out to me to, put me in a position to potentially speak with you, and also the board members of the Women's Mental Health Consortium. This is a wonderful opportunity. And then lastly, I just want to, give a shout out to my amazing coaching clients that I work with at Neural Revolution. They're all my inspiration, and being able to, look at the literature and see what we're seeing strengths wise, and then also see them, in real life is a really, really awesome opportunity. So thank you again for your time and your attention.
Okay, can you hear me, Eliza?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. We are opening up for questions. All right, we got our first. Do we ever see children with ADHD with sensation avoidance? Struggle with sensory integration might trigger extreme withdrawal.
That's a great question. And I'm not a clinician, so I'm not as well versed at answering this, but we definitely can see overlap between ADHD and sensory processing disorder. There is some research around showing that tends to be a comorbid condition. So that is a good point. I think if we look solely at the ADHD piece, looking at the regulation lens, with the sensation seeking piece, where it becomes, I think, sensory overload is at the level of the filter. So all of the information is coming in. And so instead of it being like the sensory receptors that are getting bombarded, which they are, that's not the point. That's not the point of, I guess, dysregulation. For people with ADHD, it's not being able to filter all of the things. So kind of having everything come in all at once, and that becomes overwhelming. That might kind of make an individual shut down and retreat.
Okay, we have another question, and I know Joanna wants to ask a question. I notice for a lot of my medicated patients, their hyper focus can be unhelpful. They can sort of obsess over minutia or things that they aren't even interested in. Any ideas on how to help them break away from hyper focus when it is not helpful?
Oh, I love that question. And that's where I think the research needs to go next, is kind of, I think, separate, because in my opinion, I think hyperfocus is the positive side of this, and then perseveration is where we're getting stuck, right? And so one of the things I suggest with helping people break out of hyperfocus is having timers. And the reason I say timers is because we need something in the environment that's going to capture our exogenous attentional control to help us then be able to shift what we call our endogenous attentional control. So that's our kind of internal goal-oriented focus. So for example, if I say you're working on a project and you set an alarm because you want to be able to transition to something else. Let's say you have to go pick up your kids or something. So your endogenous attention is being zeroed in on what you're currently focusing on that project. You set the alarm goes off, and the noise in the environment will should automatically capture your attention. That's what we call our exogenous attentional control. And in that moment, it allows you to break out of what you're doing, and then let you more easily decide to shift your endogenous attentional control to going and picking up your kids. So I think things that will, anything that's going to help them capture their attention. And this can be also a multi-layered approach. So I've seen some people, they'll do like a timer where they're going to get an auditory cue, but they'll also set a timer for their lights where it turns their lights off. So you have your lights go off and you got an alarm blaring, and it's enough disruption that it allows you to break out of what you're doing, break out of the perseveration part of the hyperfocus.
Right. I see several questions, and several questions are asking you to describe some of your coaching. But since there's also some specific questions about it, why don't I ask you those? So maybe you can.
Okay.
How do you help with hyperfocus and lack of hope? Suggestions on how to help with hyperfocus and lack of focus. I think you just partially answered that. And any tips to help people move the holes to match the environment? She's right. I imagine psychoeducation is helpful. Then can you speak about the struggle of procrastination that many ADHD patients struggle with? Any thoughts or tools? And sleep is often an issue with these individuals. Do you help your coaching clients address sleep issues? And are there any gender differences in your recommendations? I'm happy to reread any of those, but those were more specific, and the others were more general and asking about your approaches.
So I might need a refresher after I'll start with the hyperfocus one, promoting it and getting out of it. So we talked a little bit about getting out of it. So something that's going to be disruptive enough so that they don't have to actually make the choice, like the active choice to shift. There's a prompt that gives them the opportunity to make that shift. And that can look, like I said, different. You can have things in the environment, things that are going to, capture your attention so you don't have to catch it yourself. In terms of promoting hyperfocus, I love this question. If we look back to the things that tend to work with the ADHD nervous system, so interest, challenge, novelty, urgency, passion, if we can hit on any of those components, that can help people engage in a hyperfocus when they want to. So for example, if this is a strategy actually quite a number of my clients like to use. If there's like a particular task they're trying to get done, let's say it's the dishes, you've set a timer, and I know I'm talking a lot about timers, and I always, word of caution, there's a like love-hate with timers, I think, in the ADHD community, but you've set a timer not to annoy you, but to see if you can beat it. So it's one way to kick up challenge. So it makes it a more stimulating task. A more exciting task. Can I beat the timer? Can I get these dishes done before that goes off? So that can help with a little bit of like the hyperfocus. And same thing like with a writing project. So I'm going to set a timer for 30 minutes and I want to see if I can get this section done. If you're writing a dissertation, right, I'm going to see if I can get the results section done and beat the timer. So that can be one way in terms of cultivating the hyperfocus. But another piece that I think is really important, which is kind of in like the mindset side of it, is making sure that the task is achievable. So having clients identify like a subset of the task, a smaller chunk that is achievable, is going to be really helpful, because one, it's going to reduce overwhelm, so that might hit on a little bit of the procrastination piece. But the other part of it is that one of the things that's really important for focus is norepinephrine, and I know we talked a little bit about how lower levels are helpful for creativity and therefore might serve individuals with ADHD, but we also need to have higher levels to promote focus. And one thing that actually helps with promoting levels of norepinephrine is making sure that you have your skill set, your ability matches the task at hand. And the reason why is because there's an area in the brain called the locus coeruleus, and this is believed to be where norepinephrine is primarily produced. So that part of the brain actually also assesses whether whether or not like you are going to have essentially like you have your skill set matches the task at hand. And if it does match, then that area of the brain is actually going to do phasic release. So it's going to release norepinephrine to help kind of engage in that hyper focus, that alertness. But if your brain starts to kind of see that this isn't actually a match, it's going to like reduce norepinephrine release, or essentially it's going to, not do the phasic release anymore. It's going to just do tonic. And it's going to go into more of that diffuse mind wandering state, because the idea is that attention is expensive. It's a limited resource. And so if I'm going to use it and it's going to be expensive, like I want it to be a worthwhile investment. So if this is not serving me, if I know I can't do this, I'm not going to waste my time and my energy on allocating these resources over here when I'm not going to get an outcome that is worth it. So long story short there, for promoting hyperfocus, kick up some challenge, but also make it achievable. You want to make sure that you believe that you can get this done, that you have that skill set, because literally at the level of the brain, it's going to put you in a better position to produce more norepinephrine and focusing on that task, opposed to engaging in mind wandering and finding something else that's more achievable.
Great, thank you. You got a lot in there. I threw a lot at your ADHD brain. So what about sleep and gender, or two others?
One other point I just wanted to hit on the procrastination piece, because I know it was in there a little bit, and then I'll go to sleep and gender differences.
We got lots of time because you went very fast.
Oh, okay.
Take your time.
Oh, okay.
Thought you were waiting to hear more.
Oh, okay. So for the procrastination piece, a lot of times procrastination can be viewed more as like issues with the emotional dysregulation. I think being curious about why someone's procrastinating, like what's actually making you not want to do this thing, and really, really going at it in a very open, non-judgmental way. That curiosity can help kind of pinpoint what's actually, what's the barrier here for you. Sometimes it's lack of clarity. A lot of times it's lack of clarity, not knowing where to start, or just having it feel so big and amorphous that it's like you can't grab onto anything. So being curious, what's making this hard for me? And then second, if you're feeling like you don't know where to start, well, let's start with defining the task. That in and of itself is progress toward what you're doing. So again, I think you get the feelings of overwhelm are oftentimes a result of the task feeling really ambiguous, or it's feeling hard. And so that the challenges with, essentially, individuals with ADHD have lower stress tolerance. So challenges with dealing with that stress, it's like, I'm just going to avoid it altogether. So if you can make it easier and you can make it clearer, that might put you in a better position to getting started, and also allowing yourself to count that as progress, because that's the other thing is, a lot of times individuals with ADHD don't count like the prep work as progress toward a project. So like if they're still like outline, like if they're writing a paper and they're still like reading and outlining, they're like, well, that didn't count. And well, don't you need that in order to write the paper? So again, just kind of like gaining clarity, gaining clarity and being curious about what's making it hard for you. And then also if you can kick up some challenge too, like with the procrastination, that might get more exciting, because sometimes what they're procrastinating is like really boring stuff, like doing the dishes, or the one that, I always tell my clients, for me, is getting the mail. So trying to make it exciting, or gaining clarity tend to be really helpful, because it tends to be more an issue of like emotional dysregulation. So, and then jumping over to sleep. Sleep is a really, really tough one. I work on this a lot with my clients. And if we look at the literature too, individuals with ADHD are more likely to have sleep disorders or parasomnias. So it is a really big challenge. There's some literature saying that they have, like a delayed circadian rhythm. And so they're more prone to stay up late, fall asleep later and wake up later. And so with clients, one of the things I really kind of hit home with in this area, I don't try to make anyone do anything. It's very, very like open and self-driven, but I will talk about the science. And so we know that, you know, deficits in sleep are absolutely horrible for everybody, regardless of ADHD or not. You know, if you are sleep deprived, you can perform worse in driving tasks than drunk drivers. So it's really not good. And nor does it feel good to be sleep deprived. But when we look at ADHD, a lack of sleep is going to just worsen ADHD symptoms. You know, stress and fatigue, those experiences of stress and fatigue are going to essentially reduce functioning, if you will, in the prefrontal cortex. So that's the first area that, you know, suffers. And we know in ADHD, that area of the brain is very much so implicated. So lack of sleep is, you know, setting you up to have worse symptoms than you might have at baseline. So kind of explaining that to them, I think, can be really helpful, because again, with anything, there needs to be buy-in. That's kind of how I always talk about it. They need to actually feel connected with why the change is worth it for them. And, you know, otherwise it's like I always say, you know, we can come up with all the strategies in the world, but if you don't have buy-in, it doesn't really matter. So I think the psychoeducation part just across the board with ADHD is really helpful. And same with it, talking about procrastination and engaging in hyperfocus, but particularly with sleep too. And then I know there's kind of big push talking about like sleep hygiene and like sleep routines. And I think that's helpful, but I think also what's helpful is to explain why those routines actually are good for promoting sleep. And what I often say to my clients is our brain is always kind of looking for cues in our environment to tell us what to do. Yes, we have free will, but our brains also very much rely on our environment to kind of guide us. And so if you engage in like kind of a sleep routine, what you're kind of doing for your brain is saying like, hey, we're getting ready to shut down. You're sending it messages that are congruent with what you want to be doing. And it allows your brain to start to kind of shift into that mode. So creating those opportunities to kind of like, you know, calm down, disengage, deactivate, puts you in a better position for your brain to be ready to take on sleep. It's kind of why, you know, we say don't do anything in bed other than sleep, and you know, sexual intercourse. Those are the things those things are what bed is meant for, because if you introduce additional things to bed, your brain then essentially is going to have competition. There's going to be competing cues in that bed. And really the loudest cue, which is usually like, you know, air quote, the sexiest cue, is what's going to win out. And it's usually not sleep. So working with them to create, I think, you know, an evening routine that they actually like, that they actually want to do. And then also explaining why it's helpful to do that in terms of what it does for the brain. And then I think the next thing was gender differences. Could you also just give me a little bit more for that one? I can't remember what the full question was.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to read them all.
That's okay.
It was my ADD brain. Are there any gender differences in your recommendations? Do you work differently with men and women? What I think is
great. Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that's a hard one to answer. So I guess what I will say is that ADHD shows up differently for women relative to men, same, you know, even as kids, girls versus boys. So one of the things that I often focus on with women with ADHD, and it's not, I guess this is more in terms of where I focus with psychoeducation, is we talk a lot about hormones. So this is, again, some of the newer research. It's been really challenging to do research on women and ADHD and hormones because it's very expensive. And I know as a women's organization, I need say no more. But we will focus a lot on this piece for women, because women with ADHD, their symptoms are more likely to fluctuate. as a function of the menstrual cycle. So if we look at the menstrual cycle, the first half of it, we've got the follicular phase. So during the follicular phase, estrogen is, rising steadily. Then we hit ovulation, and then estrogen starts to plummet and progesterone starts to rise. So the reason why we focus on this is because estrogen actually helps with the production of dopamine. So women with ADHD, one of the things we joke about in my practice is that for 2 weeks out of the month, we're on fire. We're like unstoppable superwoman. And then we get into the luteal phase, so post-ovulation, and it's like, wow, I don't know what I was thinking. I joke with my clients that I'm going to go work at the grocery store and I can't do this anymore, just because of how big that drop is. And so with the rising of estrogen, it's going to, put you in a better position in terms of available dopamine. Post-ovulation, when your estrogen drops, it's likely the case that you're also getting a corresponding drop in dopamine too. So what that means is that you're working with even lower baseline levels than you were originally. And so you might see symptoms flare during the luteal phase. So that's a big piece that I focus on with my clients, because it's important to plan around your energy. One of my biggest take-home points with my clients is that time management for ADHD is more about energy management, where your energy ebbs and flows, and match tasks that are a fit for that quantity of energy, but also that type of energy. So if you're analytic in the morning and your energy is high, write those papers, read those hard books, those hard journal articles. If you're, and if it's in the evening that you have that energy, put that thing there, but also pay, like I said, quantity, but also the type. So this is to say that with my female clients who menstruate, I put an emphasis to look out for the signs in your menstrual cycle and try to plan around it. If like this particular week, you are going to be in your luteal phase, adjust your expectations, and if possible, plan around it. Maybe, you can only handle meetings, in one example. So you'll plan your meetings, but there's no additional things that are happening in that week. You take stuff off of your plate to meet you where you're at. So that's one thing for my female clients that I tend to kind of hit home on. And in terms, I know I was talking about the menstrual cycle, women who are, premenopausal and menopausal, same thing here. We talk a lot about symptoms may have emerged during this time, or they may have worsened, and working with, finding a specialist who understands ADHD and ADHD in women to work with them in terms of pharmacology. So this is kind of like the Wild West right now, because there's not a lot of literature on this, but there's been a push for, in conjunction with the stimulant, maybe you're also taking, doing a hormone replacement therapy. But again, it tends to be a little bit of the Wild West there. But again, the psychoeducation piece of just like noticing that. In terms of additional gender differences, a big one I think that's important to focus on. And this comes from some of Sari Solden's work. She wrote Attention Deficit Disorder in Women. Really great book. I recommend it to pretty much all my female clients, as well as her workbook. We talk a lot about wearing many different hats. And so there are some social norms, gender, expectations that are often put on women. And that can be very, very hard for women with ADHD. And so kind of talking with them a little bit about like, if there are things that are hard for you, like for example, cleaning, like hiring a cleaning person is not a luxury, it's an accommodation. So talking about strategies that in a way so that it helps them to see them that they're not being like indulgent or they're not being lazy. It's literally, it's an accommodation. And cleaning tends to be like a really big one. And also working on delegating. I think everyone with ADHD really does struggle with delegating, but particularly my female clients, it's very, very challenging for them as well. And some of that is, I think, pressure, feeling the pressure of societal expectations, or, being the perfect mom if they have kids, in one example, or the perfect wife. So in terms of, I guess, differences in genders, the big focus on the menstrual cycle and how hormones are at play, and then also helping them to identify strategies and view them as strategies and accommodations, and not as like luxuries or indulgent.
Great. The questions are flooding in, and you have answers for all so far. I'm going to take a slightly different question, and then I have another one afterwards. But as much as we encourage ways to support the conditions and the environment to promote strengths, but do you find that when individuals are in fitting environment, they are also more emotionally regulated and therefore connected and in tune to the people around them? Question. We are speaking a lot more about tasks, abilities, and so forth, but we are also humans with needs to belong.
I love that question. I think we often focus on work because it's like an easy in there, but I love this question. I think I would agree. I think there's better emotional regulation in social environments where they feel like they fit in, where they don't feel like they have to mask, because a big thing that we see with ADHD is kind of like a colloquial term, rejection sensitive dysphoria. So this is, intense, basically, intense fear of real or perceived rejection, criticism, and again, fits in with the emotional dysregulation. So being in safe environments where people are, I think, are accepting of them, puts them in a better position to have more meaningful friendships, more positive friendships, and also opportunities for growth, meaning that, like, if they have a moment where maybe they have, an impulsive remark, because that's what we see, I think, a lot in the social realm with hyperactivity and impulsivity, right? There might be just the blurting out of something. In safe environments, there's not going to be, hopefully, not a shaming factor to that. And so if you're promoting positivity, as I mentioned with the broaden theory, the positive broaden theory of emotions, experiencing positivity is going to help you to broaden your potential thought and action repertoire, and also build these resources in different realms. So in the positive, with positive emotions, you might be better equipped to access strategies that serve you in those moments. So if you do start to feel yourself, going to blurt something out, you might be in a better position to inhibit, because you're not in a more stressful, like, fight and flight mode, which is usually, it's much harder to inhibit things like that in those moments. So I think, long story short, I would agree with what you said. And so finding social environments that are a good fit for these individuals. And there's a kind of a joke in the community that ADHDers always find each other because they're safe people, and I find this to be true. It's like anytime I go anywhere, somehow I always find the other person that has ADHD. And then my husband kind of like pokes fun at me about it.
Great. That was a great to get to the emotions, because that's super important. The next question I see in several different veins, but I can ask it, in general, what are your thoughts on medication, on people needing to be off medication for pregnancy, and on people who self-medicate with, pot or alcohol to fall asleep, but, pot for, and probably other things too. What are your thoughts on other substances?
So with medication, I think, case by case, I'm pro medication when it makes sense. And then I'm like, not anti-medication, but I'm like, if it doesn't make sense, then we don't, it's not an option. I think medication is one of the best things we have. With ADHD, it's actually one of the most treatable disorders in terms of, psychopharmacology. Some of the biggest effect sizes for the stimulants are some of the biggest effect sizes exist for the stimulants in the literature. And so if someone is a good fit for them, I think it's absolutely a vital tool. And even if you aren't a good fit for stimulants, there's also, non-stimulant options. But, with the stimulants, what we're doing is leveling the playing field. We're giving you the appropriate levels of the neurotransmitters that, in theory, you have lower levels of. So if you have adequate levels of those neurotransmitters, it's going to give you better accessibility to these different parts of your brain that are hard to be able to recruit in the absence of appropriate levels of, dopamine and norepinephrine. So again, I think you gotta meet your client, your patient where they're at. If they're open to it, great. And if they're not, for whatever reason, helpful to explore that. Sometimes there's real medical reasons. And then there's a small percentage of individuals who are non-responders. So I think medication is an excellent tool, but it's not the end all be all. Medication is more like glasses. We put glasses on so that we can see, but just by wearing glasses, it doesn't mean that you can read. You got to build that skill, and the glasses help you do that. In terms of other substances, that is also an emerging literature. In terms of pot, there's a lot of disagreement there. I think it's also case by case. Some individuals with ADHD can really help them. And others, it can, I think, not help them. And although what might bring them to them is more of like a self-medication approach. And you can, I think, with anything, when you self-medicate, it can spiral potentially out of control. There's some literature, suggesting that certain strains of marijuana, for example, can act stimulant-like. Typically the sativas, that's what we see. But I think it's a tough call. And I think it's also going to be individual differences. Some people, maybe they are well suited to use that as a treatment option, and other people, it might not be a good option. In terms of using marijuana for sleep, and same with alcohol. Again, one of the challenges with using marijuana for sleep is it can actually cause you to skip your REM cycle. And REM is really important for learning and a little bit of memory consolidation. So although maybe it promotes sleep, you might be missing out on REM sleep, which is important. Alcohol usually is not good for sleep. It may promote sleepiness, so helping you to get to sleep more quickly, but it's going to lower the quality of your sleep. So I don't think alcohol is usually a good idea. But again, these are areas that I'm not as well versed in, but it wouldn't be a suggestion that I would make to consume alcohol to promote sleep.
Great. Okay. And what is your thought on medicating children and how it impacts neurodevelopment? And sort of both sides, some people who are resistant, some people who want to do it, but basically medication in children with ADHD.
It's a great question. So I think first and foremost, make sure you're 100% on that diagnosis, that you trust the diagnosis, and 100% certainty, or 99.9% certainty that this child absolutely has ADHD. I think medication in children is a good idea, because there's some research showing that if you catch ADHD early enough in children and you do give them a stimulant, it actually puts them at a better chance of their basically the structural differences that exist in the brain. It actually provides them a better chance of having that development actually normalize, meaning that it has potential to course correct brain development so that that brain would look like, a neurotypical brain as an adult. So it can actually potentially result in that 1 out of 3 children that grow out of the disorder, because 2/3 don't, and it persists into adulthood. And apparently a third, it doesn't persist. But again, that's still a little bit of a shaky statistic. But I think that if you feel very, very confident in that diagnosis and you're 100% on it, I think medication is worth a shot because it does provide the opportunity to kind of like correct neurodevelopment, and maybe that child has a chance of growing out of the ADHD. But more work is needed to be done, I think, to really pinpoint that.
Great. Several people have asked for the name of the book and the workbook again. And
Oh, yeah. Should I put it in the chat?
Sure.
Is that a good idea?
I'll read it out if anyone's not on the chat. Or why don't you read it while you're writing it?
Sorry, sold in attention deficit disorder in women. That's the book. And then I think the workbook's like the same name. I always forget the name of the workbook. But if you find
Sorry, sold.
Solden.
Oh, that's the author.
Yep. Attention deficit disorder in women, the second edition.
Okay. I can put that. I'm not sure who else is in the chat, so I'll put it in the elsewhere. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, okay. And some more questions. I wonder about helping someone with inattentive ADD find the passion to decrease symptoms. I'm thinking of someone who tends to be passive. Do you find that they need external structure to suggest options and how to get them to take action and find focus?
That's a good question. So I think there's sometimes disagreement in the suggestion realm, but what I've found a lot of times with individuals with ADHD, sometimes with individuals who have inattentive presentation, giving them suggestions and options helps create a springboard for them to develop their own ideas. Because a lot of times if they're on their own and they're trying to come up with solutions, they start to spin their wheels and get stuck. But if you can, help them to come up with, different ideas or options, or like even make suggestions yourself, that could be a nice springboard to get them going. In terms of like, with an inattentive ADHD, I still think if you can help them identify what they're passionate about, like what really excites them. Because most of the time I feel like those questions don't always get asked, because usually it's like, why didn't you get your work done? Like, why didn't you take the laundry out of the dryer? Which are understandable and valid questions, but not many times do they get asked, like, what excites you? What's something you would look forward to? Because again, if we can tap into some of the more positive emotions and more of like the possibility oriented thinking, that could start to kind of galvanize action. And part of that might be because it's more dopaminergic. So dopamine, I like to think of as like, it's involved in motivation. It's heavily involved in regulation, but I like to think of it a lot of times as like the molecule of possibilities. So when we're thinking in the possibility space, that tends to be more of like a dopamine enhancing style of thinking. Because dopamine tends to be about like what things we don't quite have yet. So thinking about, what opportunities exist for me, kicking up that excitement, it might help tip them over into a more of like a motivated to do some of the things that matter space. And I had a client, when we reframed things in terms of considering possibilities, that was a big shift for them. And they were also inattentive ADHD. And helped them, do things that really mattered for them, which then had positive downstream effects for doing the things that, we have to do.
Great. So last question, although there's, okay, well, in speaking about comorbidity, are there any ways to tease out what might be undiagnosed ADHD versus a complex trauma presentation, where there may be also emotional dysregulation, distractibility, inattention, impulsivity, etc.?
That's such a good question. I don't think I'm the best person to answer that. What I will say is that trauma is very, very, very common in individuals with ADHD. There was a recent study that came out, and I don't remember the specific statistic, but essentially individuals with ADHD experience greater rates of trauma than people without ADHD. They score higher on the ACE scale, these adverse child experiences. And trauma looks very, very similar to ADHD. So I think that it's a really tough question. And I think you need to be well versed both in ADHD and in trauma to be able to disentangle the diagnoses, and whether it's totally ADHD, totally trauma, or comorbid. With the ADHD brain, it's just kind of like the perfect brain to develop trauma, because as I mentioned, we're talking about regulation and the floodgates. So if you having like a negative event, you're going to get, the amygdala kicked up, right? But the amygdala also speaks with the prefrontal cortex, and in ADHD, that connection runs a little bit haywire. So the ability for the prefrontal cortex to tell like the amygdala, like, hey, like we don't have to get this activated for this thing, that doesn't quite happen. So you get the flooding of intense negative emotions, and then it just kind of sets up that perfect storm. So I think my best answer is have a good understanding of both of them, but also understand that trauma tends to also co-occur with ADHD, and we don't know if it's like because of parent specifics with parenting. Sometimes it's the case that kids with ADHD might be more challenging children, and parents with children with ADHD might also have ADHD themselves. So there's a lot of pieces that come into play, and some people actually even suggest that maybe ADHD is actually like just an adaptation to trauma, how the brain adapts to a trauma. So that's a really tough one. And I think, given my scope of practice, I'm probably not the best person to answer that.
Yeah, I think it'd be very hard to know the causation or correlation between the two, but there is certainly a ton of overlap. So it was a good. All right, with 1 minute left, and maybe you can send these to us after.
Sure.
Do you have any books for partners, neurotypical partners of loved ones with ADHD, and books, current or literature books for kids and ADHD? If you think of any, you can send them to me and I'll send them out to the.
Yeah. In terms of like couple stuff, if you look at any of Melissa Orlov's work, she's got a lot of stuff. I'm less well versed in kids and couples. It's just not an area that I tend to like be as involved in. So I'm more of like the superficial level, I think, of that information. But I do recommend, Melissa Orlov's work. She does a lot of stuff with couples. She has actually a program or like a course for couples with ADHD, whether both or the individual only one has it. Kind of like a coaching like therapy program. I have a client that's done it and is really enjoying it.
Someone asked us, although we're the Women's Mental Health Consortium and the book was Attention Deficit Disorder in Women, there was a feedback to use more gender inclusive language, which I realized as I was reading a question, but in any case, this was fabulous. I take no credit for booking you, but as someone who was diagnosed with 99th percentile ADHD at age 27, it was extremely interesting. And it sounds like it was very interesting for many, many people. So thank you very much for getting that all in. We have lots of positive feedback here and love the work you're doing. It sounds like there's great work you're doing and great work to be done. So we thank you very, very much.
Yeah, and thank you as well for the opportunity. It was really, really great to, be here and be able to speak about, something that I love, like as a scientist, as a coach practitioner, and then also just as, an individual with ADHD. So thank you all too for this awesome opportunity.
All right. Eliza, thank you very much. And we'll get you the video when it's ready, and love to stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Take care.
You as well.